Today's presentation is Innovative Solutions for Fast-Tracking Drugs for Rare Diseases. Today's speaker is Oliver Leatham. Oliver is currently a Vice President and Global Head of Value and Access at Certara. He has extensive experience in product commercialization, market analysis, payer engagement, and modeling health outcomes. Oliver has a specialty in real-world evidence and innovative contracting. Oliver, welcome to today's event. I'll now turn it over to him to begin his presentation.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and thank you for that very kind introduction, and welcome everybody. It's great to have such so many and such a diverse range of people on the phone today, so I hope we can give a little bit of something to everybody to take away from today's talk. Let me first start by telling you a little bit about myself. I think Suzanne's already done a great introduction, so maybe I'll tell you a few fun facts. First of all, I'm from the Gower in South Wales. It's a very famous coastline. If you're going to visit there, only do it in summer, but you'll find some beautiful long sandy beaches. It's famous for a few things. It's famous for Bonnie Tyler, if you come from my era, and it's also famous for Catherine Zeta-Jones, who actually used to live around the corner from me, but soon ran away to fame and fortune in Hollywood. If you grow up in Wales, you end up playing rugby, and unfortunately, a lot of my friends end up looking like this. But this is just part of the culture, part of the fun of growing up in such a rugby-inspired culture. Tell you a little bit about my career, just briefly. I started off playing a lot of tennis and coaching tennis through college. I then used to develop sports facilities, including an Olympic rowing centre in London Docklands. So if you were to ever fly into London City Airport, you would see that there's an Olympic rowing course there, which was part of the bid for the 2012 Olympics. And then finally, I've spent the best part of my last 20 years in market access. And as Suzanne already mentioned, I specialize in real-world evidence, innovative contracting, and outcomes-based agreements. And I was fortunate enough to be part of some of the very early outcomes-based agreements in place in Europe. My market access history was both in consulting and in pharma. So I worked, for example, for Cello Health Consulting, for Astellas, building and running a market access team there. In PowerXL, which is a global clinical research organization working very closely with real-world evidence teams and across the market access function. And now heading the value and access team for Certara Evidence and Access. So this is not me. And this guy's got a lot more hair than I have. But this, the reason I put this picture up is I went to a meeting recently that involved the FDA, NICE, the SMC, AFA, IQWiC, HAAS, all the world's major HTA bodies. And there was a message relayed from the FDA, who spoke first via Donald Trump, and that was that America is paying too much for their drugs. But he had a simple solution. The solution was that all we have to do is get the rest of Europe to increase the price of their drugs to offset the subsidy that America are putting. So I have a little question for you now, just to kick things off. Suzanne, could we go to the link, please? Okay, so what do you think? Should Europe increase drug prices so that the US won't have to bear the brunt of drug development? Is this the solution? Is this the answer?
So if you're listening in our audience, again, we encourage you to participate in interactive polling by going to the website www.menti.com, and the code is 422167. It looks like you guys have figured it out and are already starting to answer, so that's fantastic.
Yep.
Thank you.
We're starting to get a bit of a mixed poll. We're heading more towards the no than the yes, but it's pretty close at the moment. Okay, quite an interesting response. This was at a European meeting, so I think the response from the audience was more on the no front, but it's quite interesting that the audience is saying yes, a little bit more here. I'll tell you what the response from the audience was, and we never actually reached a resolution on this. And I can see the point. I can see the point from Trump. I can see the point from the FDA. I understand that the US really are spending a hell of a lot of money on their drugs. They are footing the bill for a lot of the world. But maybe that's not the only solution. And what somebody in the audience actually said at this point was, what is really costing us? What's the big cost of drugs, and why do we have to pass on this cost? And really, the big cost was in terms of R&D. So the question for the audience was, what if we could work out a way with UHTA bodies to fast-track products through, say, phase 2B, do smaller real-world evidence studies on smaller populations, but pass on some of that saving to the healthcare system? What if we could look at doing that instead of just expecting Europe to increase the price of the drugs and the US to reduce theirs? And again, there is no right or wrong answer to this. This is just the way the way the discussion went. It's very interesting to see the poll is fairly equal here. The poll, when we did it in Europe, was very much towards the no. So if we can go back to the slide deck, I think I'll move on from this picture. Okay. So if we think about the way health systems that pharma companies are set up, traditionally we're set up to get through health technology appraisals. And I really think about this as like qualifying for the Olympics and getting to the starting line, but not necessarily being ready to run in the race. So how do we get beyond that point? How do we think ahead to what the market needs actually are? How do we get beyond regulatory approval and consider things that are important to payers and to clinicians, and consider market access as a whole? And one element to this, one potential solution for this, is to look at outcomes-based agreements and real-world evidence. But there's a lot of challenges here. There's challenges around national policy, which often doesn't exist to account for outcomes-based agreements. Many health systems are decentralized. If you think about Italy, for example, it's like going through multiple health systems to get your product reimbursed. There's no one-size-fits-all. There's the availability and quality of data. If you promise to collect good real-world data and outcomes, patient outcomes, you want to know that the quality of data is there and it's good and it can be tracked. And there's also the administrative burden. Who's going to take that on? Is it the company? Is it the health system? And the HTA bodies themselves said some things about this, and I'm just going to give one example from the German Federal Joint Committee, the GBA. They're saying there's still a lot of challenges exists for innovative products, orphan diseases, and advanced therapy medicines from a HTA perspective. First of all, there's often limited evidence at launch. Study populations are very small. There's little comparative study evidence, and many of you might know that in Germany, they like to actually designate the comparator that you need to go up against. And there's often limited evidence on the long-term effects of a product. And then there's the big question around potentially curative treatments with a one-time administration cost, very high-cost products. What do we do for these products? But they do give some advice on this and how we should approach it. First of all, we should engage early, and we should gain early advice from them about our evidence generation planning. Let's make the evidence generation fit the needs of the system. They also say that any evidence generated after market entry will require a follow-up benefit assessment, which will be time restricted. So the timely start of any study is crucial. So that means when you come in asking for early access, for example, and let's say a phase 2B, you need to have your real-world evidence protocol ready and in place and ready to go at the time of launch. And your proposal should also include alternative solutions until new data can be submitted. You need to be willing to put in place things like risk share agreements or pay per performance or pay installment schemes. And often there's no one-size-fits-all. It's about trying to find the right fit for your product in your population, in your marketplace. Now, I quite like this picture. Now, this was written by a colleague of mine, a chap called Sean Tunis, who's a US payer, who came and gave a recent advisory board with us. And he was asked to write an article for the Christmas edition of the New England Journal of Medicine. And I found this very interesting because he said that basically what we start with in pharma often is intellectual curiosity. We build our evidence around something that works. What is the efficacy? What's the safety of our product? Does it work for a patient? Is it going to make them feel better? Great. Then we publish this evidence. And then we send this evidence to the health technology assessment. Now, this is the cell membrane. And they're saying that this is the first wall that we hit. This is the first block that we hit and the first pushback we get. Then we've got to diffuse this knowledge through the system, through to the payers, through to the clinicians, and eventually to the patient. And there's currently effective transport of this information across this system. And his thinking is that, what if we start here? What if we start with these end decision makers? What if we start with the payers? What if we start with the clinicians and the patients? And think about what our target product profile should be. Think about the evidence we might need to generate to meet the needs of these people, and then work backwards for our evidence generation plan and all our commercial activities so that what we're doing here fits the needs of the people down here. So basically what they're saying is payers particularly need to be included, their considerations need to be included much earlier in the evidence generation planning cycle. So first of all, taking early advice from HTAs, thinking about the cost of products in the real world, think about health utility costs and savings, and think about working with these people and with these bodies to co-develop approaches that will meet the needs of everybody, both the pharma company and the payers. And you have to think about payers sometimes, I think, as like your finance director in work. It's almost their job to say no. It's their job to manage a budget. It's their job to reduce spend. So it's expected that they will say no to you and to find some way to push back until they have assurances that you're going to give them something of value. It's our job, really, to show them that what we're going to give them might cost them more money up front, but it may save them money further down the line. And this is where considering cost effectiveness earlier in the evidence generation process is important. It's been important in Europe for some time, but it's now becoming more important in the US as well. We need to think about, if we're going to take on some high-cost product, how is it going to pay for itself? Is it going to help keep people out of hospital? Is it going to reduce polypharmacy? What else is it going to do in terms of health system savings? Is it going to allow us to treat patients closer to home? These are the sorts of questions we need to think about when we're planning our evidence. So there's some historic examples, and I'm picking some big top-line ones here, of where people have got through HTA successfully, and they've done really well at that level, but they have completely failed in terms of reimbursement and market access. And I think one of the most famous examples is Glybera. So Glybera was a product that cost over $1 million per patient. It was a potentially curative therapy, and it was approved by the EMA in, I believe, 2012. But in 4 years later, have a guess at how many patients actually were on this product. It was one. One patient in the whole of Europe was prescribed this product because payers just saw the cost as too high, and nobody saw the long-term benefit of this product. So eventually, it was pulled off the market in 2016. Another example is repatha. So repatha was launched and got approved by the regulatory bodies with the ability to reduce LDL-C levels, low-density lipoprotein C levels, which should reduce the risk of cardiovascular events. But payers said, so what? What's it actually going to do for us? How many strokes are you going to prevent? How many MIs are you going to prevent? And repatha said, right, okay, let's go back and collect this data. So they went back and retrospectively collected this data, and they showed that they could reduce heart attack by 27%, stroke by 21%, coronary vascularization by 22%. And they also put an innovative contract around this, a risk share, saying that we will refund the cost of repatha for any eligible patients who have a heart attack or a stroke on our product. This gave the payers the assurance to go ahead and reimburse the drug. The question here is, could they have had that evidence planned earlier? Could they have got to market earlier and gained more market share? But at least this is an example of where the company was willing to back their product in market and put a risk share scheme around the outcomes. So there are some historic examples of what payers and regulators are willing to accept. And I've tried to choose a few that use quite different approaches, so to see which one might be the right fit for your product. So let's think about managed entry agreements. So J&J's Velcade, first of all, was an early example in multiple myeloma. Now, they anticipated that they were going to get a negative NICE appraisal. Now, the NHS agreed that they would pay full price for the product, but J&J would reimburse all patients who failed after 4 cycles of treatment. So this gave the NHS confidence that the company was willing to back their product. And it led to significant access and reimbursement. One of the complications, though, was in collecting the data. The health authorities took this burden on themselves and found it very difficult to audit, and sometimes they couldn't track the patients that should be reimbursed by the company. But J&J stepped in and helped to mitigate those early issues, and the scheme was a success. Another example that's worked is try before you buy schemes. Cimzia is a great example in rheumatoid arthritis. It was the 4th anti-TNF drug to reach the UK market for rheumatoid arthritis. But it was very undifferentiated. Everyone saw it as another Me Too product. The only slight difference was that the drug may work slightly quicker than some of the other anti-TNFs out there. So UCB decided if the drug's going to work, it'll work quickly, if at all. So they decided to offer the first 3 months of treatment free. And they proposed this to NICE before they risked a negative reimbursement decision. The scheme allowed the NHS to save $3,500 or 40% back per patient per year. And they also reduced the administrative burden of tracking patients by putting in place a home care provider. The cons of this was that it required considerable investment from UCB to set up the system, but the outcomes were that Cimzia gained a huge market share in RA and were able to compete with some of the earlier to market anti-TNFs. And another example is co-creation, and this one I particularly like because it involves working very closely with health authorities or HTA bodies. And a good example is Novartis's deal with the French healthcare system for Xolair in acute asthma. The government agreed to make Xolair available at a high requested price if the evidence of the drug's real-world effectiveness was collected according to a protocol that was designed in conjunction with the payer. So it was co-created. The study protocol was co-created between the payer and the pharma company. And Xolair promised to decrease the risk of hospitalizations due to exacerbations of severe asthma. And they took results from 750 patients out of around 6 sites, and they were actually able to demonstrate this. And there was really early pros to this, and it really showed that pharma were able to maintain a premium price while generating peer-reviewed real-world evidence that was backed by the health system and the payer themselves. And then a recent example in anti-infectives, quite a challenging environment to work in and sometimes a government-subsidized area. We had a product that had great efficacy. It worked in about 95% of patients, but it was seen as very high cost. And patients were going into hospitals with acute infections and were being sent home with very low cost, ineffective anti-infective products. But the hospital were ticking those patients off as being successfully treated because they'd gone home. What they weren't taken into account of was those that went back to see their GP, those who came back into hospital again and required second and maybe third line treatments, and even some patients died. So we hypothesized that by using this higher cost product first line, it would actually save the system money, but it would also prevent those deaths and improve patient outcomes. We chose 3 centres in each of the UK, Germany, and France that were willing to pilot this and work with us on this. So rather than going to the health system as a whole, we found pilot sites where people were willing to do this. We collected data on 600 patients and tracked their outcomes. And as a result, we were able to show that the product was successful, it was cost effective, and in the real world, only 8% of patients failed on treatment versus 5% in trials. And we put a risk share in place. And the risk share was that if greater than 10% of patients failed in the real world, we would reimburse the system. So we ended up not even having to reimburse the system for doing this. So this is an example of where good relations with local centres work, where there's good data, good audits, and where people are really willing to work with you to help reshape the guidelines. And then this is something that can be rolled out at a national level. And as I mentioned, there are difficulties. There are difficulties in finding centres that are willing to do this. There are difficulties in data capture. So one of the things we need to do ourselves is to think innovatively about how we do this. How do we capture this data? What are the options for us? And there is a lot of technology, tech-enabled data capture out there these days. So first of all, we can think about integrated patient support. We can think about patient wearables and body sensors. We can consider going direct to patients and treating people in the community. And there's mobile apps and tools which allow you to track when you took your tablet, how many tablets you took, how much, what the types of, what sort of side effects you can expect. So it helps maintain patients on their treatment and helps to improve patient outcomes. But it also gives us a better way to track this data as we go forward. And we have a couple more questions for you. Could we go, Suzanne, to the questions again? Okay, so thinking about some of the innovative contracting agreements that we talked about managed entry, risk share, try before you buy. There's the possibility of payment in installments and co-creation. What resonates most with you? Where do you think your products are most likely to fit? And what do you think would resonate best with the healthcare systems? Give everyone a moment just to vote on this. Managed entry agreements and risk sharing are fighting it out at the top. And co-creation is catching up. Payment in installments comes last. Okay, now that's very interesting. Yeah, I think risk sharing is very exciting and resonates extremely well with payers and with health systems these days, because risk share means that you're willing to put your money where your mouth is and back your product and pay back the system if it doesn't work. Managed entry agreements are also helpful because it means that you get some time in market to try your product, sometimes for free or sometimes at a reduced cost. Co-creation works well, but it's a difficult one sometimes to negotiate, and it's sometimes hard to get around the table and to get the right advice. Payment in installments, I think, works well in some therapy areas, less in others. It works very well, I think, for potentially curative therapies where you might want to spread the cost over 2 or 3 years. But then the health system might say, well, what happens if the patient dies, or what happens if something else happens to the patient and they get killed in a car crash? Do you still have to pay the system for that? And try before you buy schemes, yes, are often accepted, but are sometimes a little bit harder to implement. So I think this gives a similar sort of outcome to the way we've had these questions before. And so thank you very much for that. And the next question, Suzanne, please. So how ready do you feel as an organization, thinking about the way organizations are traditionally structured, how ready do you think they are for implementing innovative contracting agreements? Are you an early adopter? Have you done some of these schemes in the past? Are you something you're considering, and you've got the infrastructure internally to do? Is it just something you're thinking about, but you don't have the infrastructure? Or is it something you haven't yet thought about? Hopefully everyone's thought about it a bit because they're on this webinar today. Okay, so it looks like most people are in consideration, but without infrastructure. But we do have a couple of early adopters, which is great to see. And there's some people in consideration with infrastructure, and that's also exciting because I've spoken to a couple of companies lately, some big and some small actually, and they've actually got innovation teams set up to look into exactly this, to look at what can they do differently in terms of their product development. These teams are engaged between clinical and commercial. They sit in a room and the clinical and commercial teams look at their evidence generation plan and they overlay their market access strategy on top of that evidence generation plan, and they look for opportunities for those early launches or the risk share agreements. And what they often do is draw 1, 2, or 3 different pathways that they could take with the product, depending on the early advice that they get from the HTA bodies or depending on the market they're looking at. And sometimes they narrow that down to 2. Sometimes there's only one way to go. But there's often a solution there. And I think it's only by having these kind of conversations, by listening to these kind of talks, by engaging with the health authorities earlier, that we start to think this way. And I think getting pharma to think a little bit differently about how we do these things is essential. But also the health technology bodies, as we said, are willing to open the doors now and for us to sit around the table and come to them with these kind of solutions. Can we go back to the slides, please? Thank you, Suzanne. So, to summarize, really, it's up to us as companies now to work together, to look at best practice, to think about ways, new and innovative ways to find solutions for our products, to be willing a little bit to put our money where our mouth is and come up with some form of risk share, to understand the health systems and to work backwards from the clinicians and the payers towards the to work backwards and to build into evidence generation plans things like cost effectiveness, real world effectiveness, outcomes data that's going to generate reduction in healthcare utility costs, things that are going to help save the system money. We need to think very creatively about how we do this, but we also need to help understand from best practice, from speaking to one another, what's worked well in the past and what health systems are really willing to accept. Really, at the end of the day, it's up to us to back our products in the real world. It's up to us to look for ways to save costs in R&D that can be passed on to the health system, but also allowing us to get these innovative and creative solutions to patients quicker, patients with really high unmet needs who really need these therapies a lot quicker. So we're really doing the whole system a favor if we can start to think this way. So thank you very much for listening. It's been a whistle-stop tour of innovative contracting, but I think we have a little bit of time for some questions. So Suzanne, maybe we could move on and open the floor to questions from the audience.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Oliver, for that fantastic presentation. As Oliver mentioned, we'd love for our audience to use the Q&A box, which can be found on the lower right of your screen. Just enter your questions to all panelists, and we'll be happy to answer as many as we can. So it looks like someone wants to know, how do we know what the best innovative contracting option is for our product when every therapeutic area is so different?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because it's very hard to determine what the best solution is without really understanding, the size of the market, the patient population. Are you going for a niche population or a broad population? What kind of endpoints are you likely to have at launch? Are you going to have a surrogate or some pretty hard endpoints, like the case with repatha? Can you prove, reduced hospitalizations and things, or is it something fairly top line, like an LDL-C level reduction? So I think there's so many factors at play. It's hard to understand the fit until you understand the product and the market that you're going for. And it's also understanding, I think, what payers will accept in your marketplace, because some health authorities are much more willing to look at these things than others. So if you understand the needs of the marketplace, if you understand the needs of the payers, then I think you can help come up with the right solution. In the UK, for example, people often look at cost effectiveness. So can you basically keep people out of hospital, reduce health utility costs? In Germany, they're very focused on comparative efficacy. So how do you perform compared to what's already on the market? And if there's nothing already on the market, then what's your nearest comparator? Or is there an example of a product with a similar patient population coming in at a similar sort of price point that you can take from another therapy area and use that as your analog? And I think case analogs are often the best way to go here, looking at what's worked in the past and what's been accepted, and then trying to work through what's the best solution for your product. And as I said, another way to do that is to actually, map out early the 2 or 3 different approaches that you could possibly take, and then test those hypotheses with payers in the market, with regulators, and see which ones are likely to be accepted. But there's no one size fits all.
Makes sense. One of our attendees wants to know, how do we go about convincing HTA agencies that we can generate the outcomes they need to see to retain price and access?
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that GBA mentioned earlier, and the other HTA agencies also stated at the same sort of meeting we had, was about early engagement. So having that conversation early with them about, what additional data are we going to need to collect in order that when you reassess the product, which they're going to start doing in a couple of years' time, and Germany have actually specifically said, we want real-world evidence for innovative therapies, and you're going to have to do it within a certain time scale, and we're going to reassess your product after that time scale. So what's really important, I think, is to have a protocol in place that you can go to them with. So if you're going for an early access scheme, or if you're going for an early launch, or even if you're going for a launch for after phase 3 for an innovative therapy, I think it's important that you go with that protocol in place to say, look, this is the additional data we're going to collect. We've only got this much now, but this is what we're going to collect, and then allow them to add to that. So if there's things that they need to build into that as well, then that's fine, but at least you're there and you're ready to go. And you've also hopefully got centers and places identified who are willing to work with you. So like the example with antiinfectives, where the data's good, where the people will work with you to review their patient pathway and guidelines and trial your product in the real world. And I think that's an important thing to do in terms of thinking ahead when you have those engagements.
Looks like this is our last question. How do we approach innovative contracts for products that are seen as me too versus products that are already on the market?
Yeah, I think that's a really good one. That's really about finding a niche, I guess. Me too is a tough one. If we look at the example of Cimzia that we gave earlier, Cimzia was seen as a me too, and you really got 2 options. You either come in at a different price, or with some form of risk sharing agreement if the product doesn't work, or you say, okay, we're going to put some wraparound additive services for this product. So what else can we do? Can we provide home care for these patients? Could we provide some apps or devices for these patients, like they're doing a lot in asthma now, chronic asthma and COPD and things like this? Nurses can be reached via an app on someone's iPad, and someone can ask questions about their medicine that they're taking. So they can ask, oh, crikey, I'm having these side effects. Should I stay on this product, or should I cut down my dose? But it also stops patients dropping off the therapy, and hopefully keeps them staying on longer and delivers better outcomes. So everybody gains from that. So those additional investments are one way to, and those wraparound services are one way to mitigate that. The other way is then to go in with some form of risk share, or do what Cimzia did and do the try before you buy. Is there any more questions?
I think that's it from our audience. Thank you so much, Oliver, and thank you to our audience and giving us your attention and your feedback on the questions that we asked you.
Thank you, everybody.